Hello everyone. In this session we are going to look at deploying open source application on Azure DevOps. So we are going to focus on Azure DevOps, and also we are going to look at how we can build and deploy open source application. My name is Rita Bandara. So we are conducting training and consulting across Southeast Asia. Also we are into tech development in blue chip technologies Asia. So you can check out the site. Okay, so we look at open source. Why we go for open source? It's easy to use, and we have a large developer ecosystem, and we can get latest features out of it. So that is one of the main reason we go for open source, where we can get a lot of benefits and we can get it for free, and we have a larger developer ecosystem. So today there are huge opportunities and investments for open source development. So we can look at several technologies that is involved in open source, such as React, Vue, Angular like technologies, where we can create things like mobile application, web applications, things like that, with the latest set of features. So that is the one of the key thing in open source, where these features and frameworks going to update really often, where we can get the latest benefits out of it. But once we create the application, then we come to a place where we need to build and deploy our application. So we are in this session we are going to focus on Azure platform, and we are going to look at how we can deploy our application in a continuous deployment life cycle, where let's say we go to do a new change, then our change will be automatically set up into a live environment. So we look at some of the technologies involved in open source environment. So we have React, the environment is under Node.js. When we have also Express.js, AngularJS, Vue. Then we also have Python, which is under Anaconda environment. So these are all our open source technologies that we can leverage, and then we can use this in our application development. And when we are actually deploying these things, then we need to set up these frameworks, and then we need to set up environments and set up build pipeline. So we look at how we can configure and how we can use our open source technologies into Azure platform, and how we can do continuous integration and continuous deployment using Azure environment. So here you can go for Azure DevOps, which is dev.azure.com. So in that you can create a new project which is involve several set of features. Like we can start with things like Azure boards, where we can set up some of the timelines, like we can create agile boards, things like that. Then in the repos part we can host our code. You can use GitHub, or you can use Azure Git to host your code. So the developers can collaboratively develop your application with the repos feature. Once the development is completed, or let's say you are in a phase where you want to release the initial version, you can set up build pipeline. Then you can set up some configurations, what is the version of Node.js that is using in the build. Then you can set up things like if you want to host in Azure, what are the services you are going to use. Then if you want to use Docker or Kubernetes, whether you are using those kind of containerization, then you can set up these configurations as well. Once you set up the build pipeline, we can configure into the release pipeline, and we can set up the overall project from that. So this is in this slide you can see this is a repo section, where you can see a sample open source Node.js application. So here we have the server.js file, which containing some of the JavaScript code to run the main application. Then we can execute this in the build process, and then we can deploy this to using Azure Web App. We can deploy this into the live environment. And one of the unique thing in this process is we can set this as automated development and deployment. So once you set up that, developers can easily release new features, make change requests, and do all these things much more efficiently other than the manual process, and everything will be automated once you configure the DevOps process. So let me share the project with you. So this is the project environment where we can go to dev.azure.com and you can create a new project. So first let me show the open source project. So in this project you can see just like any projects, we have the default set of components. We have the Azure boards, we have the Azure repos, pipelines, things like that. So once you go to Azure repos, you can see we will get the coding environment. Then we can set up our coding platform in that Azure repos. So then we can set up things like pipeline as well, right? So here even we can associate with the GitHub, where we can add the GitHub features. So if you want, you can directly work with GitHub, and then we can set up that the new GitHub version with the workflow. It is available with these features. So next part of the session we are going to discuss that as well. So here you can see the application where we have CSS files, fonts, images. Then we have the package.json file which containing what are the packages that is using. Then we have the server.js that containing the basic JavaScript file, right? Then here for deployment we have ARM template also. Then some unit testing where we can do some testing. In there are some sample unit testing using the Gulp framework. Then the developers can collaborate. Maybe they can create some branches like the development branches, and they can collaborate, and they can then write it to master branch. Then once it's completed, we can set up pipelines. So in here, first what we are going to do is a build pipeline. So in the build pipeline, what we can do is like we can set up how we going to compile this application. So in order to compile this, we need a Node.js environment. So we can set up Node.js, and then we can set up build pipeline based on those configurations. So this build is completely free based on the tools that you are going to use. So we can set up easily this build pipeline. And it supports a lot of different technologies, and in terms of open source, it supports a lot of these different open source technologies and components. So here you can see the build pipeline configuration. So we'll start with the Azure ACR, Azure Deployment Container Registry, right? So here we can directly connect with our Azure account. Then we can set up the Node.js. So here we are setting up 8.4. So here we can set up different Node.js versions. Then we can install dependencies by looking at the JSON file. By looking at the JSON file, we can set up different dependencies. Then here we can set up test dependencies. Before actually building up, we can do some unit testing. So as I mentioned, we are using Gulp framework for this one. Then we can set up unit testing. Then we can build the image. So we are using Azure Container Registry for this one. So we are building a Docker image because this is a one single application. So using Docker will be more than enough for this kind of application. But if your application containing multiple components that going to scale up much more heavily, and your feature release going to be much more heavily, then you can use the Azure Kubernetes service. But for this application, we can work with Docker. So here first we'll build the Docker image, then we can do the push part, that means deploying the Docker image. So this is so in the Docker platform we are going to install the Node.js in the runtime, so it can host our Node.js application. Then we are copying the ARM template that was there in the repo. Then finally put in the publish artifact. So that will be the build pipeline. Then we can go for our release pipeline. So in the release pipeline, what you can see is we can set up a release. So here we can see how we can release our application. So if you go to edit, you can see what will be your release pipeline. So here we can set up different conditions, like if you want to have multiple approval, we can set up that. So here again we can set up the Node.js version. Then we can set up app service configuration because we are going to deploy this in Azure App Service. But Azure DevOps supports multi-cloud environment. If you want to set up in another cloud, that's also possible. Then we will deploy app service. So in the app service we are using the containerized option, because you can host your Azure Web App with the container or without container directly. You can host without a containerization as well. So in this case we are going to use containerization. Then we are doing some testing as well. Then we are going to release, right? So once it's released, you will first option will be build up. Then once it build up, it will going into release. So once it's released, you will get a website like this in a URL. So where you can see your sample application is running in the environment. So once it's successful, so next comes the easy part, where we can easily configure and you can release new features, right? Because with the DevOps process, the releasing new features, making changes will be much more easy and efficient, because everything is configured. So you need to configure once, then you can make changes much more easily and effectively. So if you can want to make a change, you can go back to the code here and you can make the change, and you can make a commit, and it's then flow into the build, and it will flow into the release pipeline as well. So like that method, you can do overall this process, and it will be fully automated as well. Okay. So here you can see those are the things that we discussed in the demo. So in here is a build pipeline task, where we deploy the first container registry, then set up Node.js, install dependencies, build and push the image. Then this is a release pipeline. Then we can set up the deployment. Then we can set up any permissions you want, because it's really important to set up permissions. Otherwise what happens is, like, it will be automatically going into release. If the developer by mistake makes some change, it automatically going into the release mode. So that's why we need to make sure that we set up some permissions before actually going into release, to prevent accidental changes, right? So that is some of the things in this part. So here you can go to this DevOps environment, and then you can so let me show how you can create a new project. So where I can select a new project here, I can give a name. Then I can set up public or private, right? Then I can set the version control, and what is the technique you are going to use, either Agile, Scrum, things like that. Then it will create a project for us. Then once the project created, you get a fresh copy of a new project. So in the Azure DevOps, you can create any number of projects, any number of organizations, and inside that you can create any number of projects. Then you will get the boards, right? You will get the repos like this. Then if you have a Git repo, you can directly clone your projects from a Git repo. You can easily get some like sample codes or sample projects from a Git repo. Then you can easily get those things from there. So that will be a really easy part that we can try out. Right, so let's say, for example, like we have this kind of example project in the GitHub, or like we want to explore this one, like this is how we can create a dashboard in the React Native, React JS. So here what you can do is, like, we can easily use git clone feature, and based on that we can access this, and we can get this code into our project environment, or we can have a code in a different platform as well. So here you can see I can paste using import repository. I can paste the git, and then automatically it will import the project So there are many open source projects and and sample projects are available in the GitHub, so you can directly import from there, or you can from your own repository also you can import from here. So then automatically your repo will be committed to the master with those sample projects if everything went successfully. Then afterward you can start working on the changes, developments like that. Then you can set up your build pipeline, and you can set up a deployment pipeline based on the configuration, and there's a visual configuration as well as code based configuration using YAML YML language. That is also you can do is possible. So you can see the code from here. So you can see your entire code is now added into here, right? So where we have some demos in this, we have the source codes and we have dashboard. So there are some TypeScript codes are also available in the new React version. Then once you have your code, what you can do is you can set up a build. So in the setup a build, as I mentioned, it automatically detects some components, but we need to set up some of the things as well. So you can get like Node.js web app with Linux on Azure, because we know this is a React application. Then it will automatically keep track of your subscription. Then it's try to get some information and try to configure, but still some of the things you need to manually configure based on the account. So let me log to my account. So once you log into your account, you will provide access to the Azure account with connect it to your project on the Azure DevOps. Even though you are using the same account, still you need to create some subscription, and you need to also create a relevant web app that need to configure and validate. So that separately we need to create from Azure portal, and then it pop up from there. Then this will be the sample YAML I mentioned, where we can see the setup, where we will build and deploy based on the Node.js configurations and everything. But still we need to manage and see whether everything's okay and whether everything can be run. Then we can set up our release pipeline, and we can complete our project setup as well. Still I did not set up Azure Web App. I need to go to Azure portal and set up a web app in order to make this process successful. Then I can come back to here and set that. And also when you are working with Azure DevOps, mostly you need to familiar with this language called YAML, where it containing this kind of it's a different kind of a structure where you can see variables, stages, build stage, right? Different steps you need to take, deploy stage. So likewise the configuration. So it's mostly a configuration kind of a format, but we can set up our entire setup pipeline based on the YAML configuration. So you need to be familiar with the syntax and how you can work around the YAML programming as well. So next step is to set up DevOps process using Azure portal. So Azure portal also provide the easy to set up beginner friendly way to set up the pipeline and all the build process for you. So once you get familiar with that, then you can go to more advanced set of steps, and you can set up YAML configurations, things like that. So this service is called Devops Starter. Using a Devops Starter, we can set up it's a pre-configured set of configurations where it configure things like Azure DevOps, DevOps environment, or GitHub workflow environment, and it set up different set of technologies, .NET, Java, Python, open source as well. So once you set up that, it automatically set up web app, container registry, app service, inside everything together. So everything will be included, added together into this Devops Starter project. Once you create the Devops Starter project, it will be integrated everything together into one. This is the URL I showed you earlier, where I do all the building and do the processing. So let me showcase the project. So here the project that I have created earlier. So in this project you can see everything is configured and is hosted into connected to GitHub, and it's hosted there, where you can see your application, and you can see your code here, the UI part. Then you can see the routes, you can see your JavaScript code, right? This is express.js application. Then we can see the app.js file, and we can see the configurations, things like that. So this is your entire applications that is here. Then you have your ARM template like this. These are the the parameters and settings of the subscription details, configurations, things like that. Then we have your application details, and then finally you have your test details, like we can do based on gulp, we can do unit testing, and we can do functional testing. So these are those testing information that we have, and these are added from the application, how you can run this and how you can install dependencies, how we can build these things as well. So here you can see overall picture of your entire project and application insight. If you enable, you can see the request responses, app services running, all the configurations from here, and you can see your YAML file from here. So YAML file is the same configuration, where it containing the configuration. So you can see the path, the location, then the jobs, build job, then the deployments, all the configurations, right? So if you set up this manually, as I mentioned earlier, you need to be familiar with the syntax, like how to set up this and what are the different configurations and parameters are available. So that's why setting up this by default from the service will be provide you a head start. Once you familiar with the set of syntax and particular parameters and configurations, you can easily configure this, and then you can do much more advanced setup on your own using this technique. So let me demonstrate like how you can create a new Devops Starter project, right? So here you can add the new Devops Starter. So here you can see I can select from multiple options. I can select Python, Node.js, PHP, Java, things like that. So here I'm going to select Node.js application, where we can select this option, and if you want, you can include things like CosmoDB. So here you can then select it's a Windows Web App, Kubernetes, or Web App for containers. So as I mentioned, if you select Kubernetes, it will create entire Kubernetes cluster, and takes some additional time because it's a big infrastructure that Kubernetes, Azure Kubernetes is providing. So it's really good for large scale application, but a small scale application you can easily go for Web App for containers, which is Docker based containerization. Then it's asked to authorize with the GitHub account. So let me authorize with the GitHub account. It's okay, authorized. Then here it's asking, you can see I can directly give my hosting domain from Azure website.net, and I can select the location that I want, and what is your pricing tier. We have pricing tier as well in this, right? Or we can select what are the standard pricing tiers, right? All the configurations we can set up, right? So let me enter some details. Okay, so everything's verified. So now I can so my organization, I'm using the same DevOps organization repository, and then the same name for the web app goes, and make sure it need to be a unique one, and the legal location, right? So if everything's successful, it will create default it create everything, all the services from the beginning, from the scratch, and it will create a sample code, and it's provisioning, and it will create and build up the sample code for you, right? So this use GitHub workflow environment, that is, you can see here under demo app.github. If you go to here, you can see workflow. So it will set up this DevOps Starter workflow. So in this workflow you can see the settings, what the settings are looks like, right? So that is very much similar to the pipeline that we set up in Azure DevOps. So now you have two options. One is you can set up from Azure DevOps. You can go to dev.azure.com and set up a project and set up build pipeline and release pipeline and do all the configurations. So you can use GitHub and you can integrate GitHub with Azure Devops Starter, and then again you can build your open source project, because for open source, you know, GitHub is more compatible as well. A lot of developers are already maybe familiar with GitHub when working with open source projects, because most of the open source projects are hosted in GitHub platform. So that will be easy for you to access and work with GitHub environment. So here you can see your deployment is completed. So where we can navigate to our project environment, where it will give a glancing look about the overall status of the application. So I again need to authorize the GitHub, right? So here you can see workflow, and right now you can see it's going through the build process and the deploying process. You can see like in the Azure build and deployment, you can see now what's happening. So it's build and pushing applications at the moment, right? So it's getting from the repository, is done. Now it's doing the build and then it's deploying and run the test, right? So here this is the workflow that is doing. So you can see on the GitHub Actions, this workflow is operating and is connected with the Azure DevOps. And also you can navigate to main GitHub page, which is containing the source code of the application like this, right? So you can easily get this repository and you can build. You can get this repository and you can open up with Visual Studio or VS Code, especially VS Code. Then you can work out the code and you can then check in to here. So here you can see the default configuration. So at the moment still this is in the build mode, so you can see what's happening. So this is completed, right? Then it's verified with the Azure authentication. So some of the features in the Azure DevOps that is now they are in this feature in the GitHub workflow. So ACR authentication with the Azure Container Registry now is doing the Docker build and push to ACR. So now we can see it's push the container registry. Now it's check out from the master and the completed the job. So this part is completed. Now it's going to here deploy into AKS, but we selected as VM, so Docker will be deployed to Azure Docker instance. So the steps are very much similar like to Azure DevOps portal, but this is in the GitHub portal that we can show. So now we can see what are the options that is doing. Again, doing Azure authentication, deploying and checking the ACR credentials, deploying web app containers and checkout master, right? So you can see it's doing a seamless integration of this. If you want to do this manually, you need to set up, as I mentioned earlier, you need to create this file, which is the everything running in this workflow YAML file. So you need to set up this file. Based on that, it will execute and it will set up the pipeline to execute and build and deploy. Then once you make a code change, you can easily make a code change, and then you can go for GitHub Actions, and then you can see the changes once the process is completed. Even you can navigate to this one. You can refresh this and you can see some of the tasks are completed. Now it's creating some resources because we are doing this for the very first time. So here you can see now, right now, what is the task that is happening at the moment. We can see from here as well. So here run ARM template and deploying the particular the images that is containing the build, right? So this is the deployment part. It will take a couple of minutes. So let me go back to the slide. So in the slide, this is the last slide, which is the deployment part, where we can see you will get something like this in the Azure portal, right? so let me go back to our code. So it's still doing the build. So until that we can explore what are the services that is created under Devops Starter. So this will create a new right. So this will create a new set of services for us, right? So if you go to if you navigate to the particular resource group, you can see it will create a container registry, app service plan, and application inside, right? So the container registry is already built because in the GitHub we have seen the settings. Then now is deploying that into the web app, right? It's now deploying that to the web app at the moment for the very first time. But the second, third time could be much more faster because it's already built. So you can see this is built at the moment, right? Container registry. So you can see a demo app for a container repository is already there, right? That was created. Then here you can see the container itself, right? Like this, you can use this command to pull from that. So in here, then the final stage will be deployment into the Azure Web App using the container configurations, right? So once it's configured, you will get to see a website on this URL once all the configuration settings are completed. So now it's almost completed, going through some functional testing. Because the Gulp using Gulp framework, we can do some functional testing. So then once the testing is verified, we can finalize, and then we can see all the things result in the output, right? So this is at the moment, so you can click this and see. So it's the third stage where we do some actions based on the unit test that already there in the code. So if you go to the code, you can see in the test environment there are a couple of unit tests are there, right? The test environment. Then if you go to here, you can see some of the functional tests, right? Functional tests are included. So at the moment executing that setup test environment and test runs and post action test. So those are the last steps on this project. So this, as I mentioned, this template makes much more like efficient when you want to set up everything from the scratch. Then you once you set up that, then automatically it will be like based on your configurations, additional packages that you install, you need to make changes, and also you need to be familiar with the YAML language, where we can set up more advanced configurations, where we can look at more advanced features as well if you want to do more customizations into that. So under GitHub workflow, you can set up this YAML. But if you are on Azure DevOps, you need to go to build pipeline, and in the build pipeline you can see as I showed earlier. So here this is the YAML file, YAML file, where we can set up it from here. But either step still the same thing. You'll get the same result out of it. So once everything's successful, you should be able to get the website that is I showed you earlier from my previous demo. So you should be able to get a site like this that is running. Then once that is completed, you can easily make changes for your website, and then you can easily do CI/CD where developers can contribute to the code from GitHub. Then once the changes happen, it automatically go to the actions, and then from the GitHub workflow it will deploy into the live site, right? So very first time it can take some time. It's not much time because everything is already configured, but about 10 to 15 minutes that can take based on the environment. So once it's successful, everything successful, you can see the live site like this that I showed you from the previous demo, where we can make changes, and then we can build and deploy application, right? So when you want to deploy open source application in the Azure portal, you have two options. One is you can use directly the Azure DevOps environment using dev.azure.com, or you can use the Devops Starter that is available with Azure Service, where it configure these things into Azure services and GitHub workflows. So either options are fine. Whatever suitable for you, you can select, but it's still the configuration wise still the same. It will be deploying into a container, and then it will going to deploy into the finally to web app. But once you get familiar with the YAML configuration, you get more confidence and you get more control on your code and deployments. But if you are beginner at the moment to these deployments, best thing is like use the visual tools to set up these environments and the deployments. And then once you configure and once you set up your first project, you can then explore more into YAML configurations, how you can set up a workflow. Then you can explore more about that, and you can customize this, and then you can build more advanced features when you are building your applications and deploying your application, right? So this will be the end of our session. So in this session we discuss like how you can build and deploy open source applications. So in the demo we have used Express.js, but you can use any type of JavaScript application. As in the earlier demo I have used GitHub from React application. So you can use any type of application. Everything are running on top of mostly the Node.js environment. So what you need to set up is a build pipeline where we set up a Node.js environment build. Then we can set up a deployment where we can set up a container, or we can directly deploy into Azure Web App as well. So then we have two options where we can use Azure DevOps to set up everything, or you can use the starter Azure Starter environment. Using that is really good for beginners. They are beginner friendly, where beginners can try out that part and then they can do that. So now it's completed, everything is completed. So now you can see there is in the actions everything is workflow is completed. Now you can see the new site is running, up and running, right? Okay, so this will be the end of the session. If you have any questions, you can email for my email address that I showed you at the beginning of the session. And thank you for joining for this session. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.